Nice to meet you all. I am McShane. I've been around the data conferences for a couple of years now. From the company Forward, I'm the Senior Director of Growth at Forward. I'm really pleased to be up here leading this conversation with my colleagues and with Don, who we've been working with at Forward for a long time. We're going to be talking today, as Yanni said, about navigating this post-pandemic landscape. And we're really talking about all the different ways that economic developers can foster partnerships and accelerate growth and economic vitality in their communities. So I have a few things we're going to cover. We're going to talk about how economic developers are sort of navigating this space, especially as the emergency funds are starting to wind down. We're going to talk about some strategies for fostering partnerships between different organizations and local governments to support that economic growth that we all are looking for. And then also talk about upcoming funding opportunities. We're seeing a lot of exciting stuff in that space and want to make sure that everyone is aware of it and knows how to access it. With that, I'm going to go ahead and let my panelists introduce themselves because I don't have their resumes as memorized, and I'll just make stuff up. First, Aubrey, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Aubrey Ralph. I am Director of Research at Forward. My background has been around 15 years in community development, Southern California area. I'm based in Los Angeles. I am pleased to be here working with Forward to actually help organizations and jurisdictions administer grant funding. My background has been going after federal, state, and county grants and then administering those programs from initiation to closeout. And I understand some of the challenges and excited about continuing that great work here at Forward. Pleasure to meet everyone.
Great, thank you. Kelsey.
Hi everyone, I'm Kelsey Martin. I'm the Director of Client Services at Forward. And so my team oversees all the programs that we administer in our organization. And so prior to that, I actually worked for the City of Spokane in the Human Housing Services Department, managing the full COVID portfolio for them. And then also prior to that, I was managing a shelter in the City of Spokane, a domestic violence shelter. So all that kind of context really helps with the programs that we administer.
And we actually, before I switched on, you're missing a key piece, which is that at the City of Spokane, you actually worked with Forward. You were one of our customers. And this is not a recruitment and coaching event, I promise. We did not coach her. She left, and then we invited her to join Forward.
But there is a sign-up sheet.
Yeah, feel free to send me your LinkedIn profile. And of course, last but not least, Don.
Good morning, everyone. Don Goldberg. I'm the Director of Economic Development for the Regional Economic Partnership in Whatcom County. And so that encompasses, I'm an employee of the Port of Bellingham. The Port is the ADO. We also represent Whatcom County, the 7 cities located in Whatcom County. And I have a very diverse background, about 20 years in the private sector, 7 years in national nonprofit, and then about 8 years in the public sector. All related to economic development, commercial real estate and development, and things like that. So we can all learn a lot from each sector. Each time I'm in one sector, they have a very unreal look at what the other one is. Nonprofits always think that everybody else has the money. There's all these things. So having a diverse background has really allowed me to understand the full spectrum of economic development. And then one last thing, because I know I will be brought up, but we were one of the first clients of Live Stories. Live Stories helped us and assisted us to develop our SEDS report, the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy. And we have also worked with them on the Northwest Disaster Grant Program and have had a great relationship.
Great, thank you. And just a point of clarification. So Forward used to be called Live Stories. Some of you might have been familiar with us doing that, and Forward really started as a COVID product and offering that we have for our customers, it's been great working with Don on both the data visualization side and administering assistance programs. One final thing before I get started is that, and I'm going to totally call her out, is that Kelsey promised me that she would give me $1 if I got through the entire panel without using any curse words, which I don't think, honestly, that just isn't enough. So if she gives you a bottle of wine, maybe a
We'll see.
a case of wine, they'll be more motivated to avoid swearing. I'm really gonna try, I promise. It's like not my nature to.
I didn't
not
make that
curse a
agreement myself.
Yes, Don will be just like loose drinking over there. Well, Don, first question is for you. So we're in this post-COVID landscape, and emergency funding is really starting to come to an end. We're starting to see that really trickle down. I'm sure a lot of people here are trying to figure out how to drive economic vitality in their region, especially with this new funding landscape. What are some strategies that you have used in Whatcom County to smoothly transition away from that emergency funding to new funding opportunities?
Thanks, Raven. The first part of that would be that we chose early on not to grow our staff size. So we did not bring in a bunch of new staff to deal with the pandemic, flood crisis, a number of things that have been happening to our region as well as the entire world. So I asked of myself and my staff to just work harder, put more time in, be more strategic, and not need to bring in people that we might have to let go once we didn't have consistent funding. And I think working smarter and closer together, that policy worked out, because now we're the same staff, we're starting to have a little bit more time to focus more on what I would say our true mission is. And then during the pandemic, we finished our SEDS report, the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy. And unlike others who just create that report so they can get federal funding and grant opportunities, we really were focused on a true strategic plan. And so we were very lucky that we didn't design that before the pandemic. So we designed a strategy during the pandemic, which really includes future potential strategies for things like fires, pandemics, and other stuff.
That's really interesting, thank you. So this one is for the panel. Partnerships have always been key to maximizing the impact of economic development initiatives, right? That was never more true than during COVID. How can economic developers and local governments and other organizations form strong collaborations to address these shared challenges? We know we can't go it alone, so how do we do it together?
I would definitely say, thanks for the question. During the pandemic, there was just a need for creativity. So I think from a government standpoint, economic development standpoint, is really doing our best to facilitate a legitimate public participation process. Because when these challenges happen, you need to hear from the business community. You have to hear from your nonprofit execs. You have to hear even from your jurisdiction, coastal port areas or urban areas or rural areas. So understanding the need and really facilitating that process so that those voices are heard from a diverse variety of stakeholders.
Right. Don?
So as I said before, our tagline is Regional Economic Partnership, or REP. We're a team of four, and we can't do it all, and we can't know it all. So we highly depend on partnerships. And we work on a hub and spoke model where we facilitate a lot of other organizations and bring them together. So that's one of the ways in which we work very closely. The other one is early on, I think many of you probably went through this as well. Society was pitting the economy against the health of our society. They wanted us to choose, which was more important, to let the economy fail and address the health of our society, or to focus more on the economy and forget about the health of our society. And many communities chose one or the other. Early on, the health department and my department chose not to allow that to happen. So we created Safer, Stronger Together. And I met with the health department director daily, and we supported each other and did not allow the public or other politics to break us apart. So I would say that was a very powerful thing for our community.
And Don, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned that that's ongoing. Like you haven't, yes, from shifting into sort of this, post-pandemic, blah, 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 but you're still doing these regular meetings. Can you speak a little bit more about that and why that's working and why you decided to continue collaborating?
Sure. Like many of your communities, not all of our cities and the people within our community agree with each other. And in the past, some of those, we have 7 cities in Whatcom County, Bellingham being the largest and probably the most liberal politics. And then we have Linden, which is extremely conservative in general. And in the past, these 2 communities often were pitted against each other. We created a mayor's group that the 7 mayors, myself, and the county exec meet monthly during the pandemic for best practices on how to share resources. What was amazing about it is there was very little negativity there. It was all brought us up. We all supported each other, and that continued. So it was a very unusual situation where something negative actually created a very positive environment for the future. And I'm noticing that as we move forward, we continue to work closer than we did prior to the pandemic.
That's great. Kelsey, you've done a lot of collaboration with a whole variety of your career hats on. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think that one of the important lessons that are learned from this partnership, actually, just best explained through an example of the partnership that Forward had with Don's ADO in Whatcom County. So Forward was contracted to administer a grant, Northwest Disaster Grants, by the Department of Commerce in response to some flooding that happened in late 2021. And so in that model, Forward really relied heavily on Don and the ADOs in Whatcom County, Bellingham County, Skagit County to make sure that the program was created with their best intentions. We didn't want to have a program that was created in a silo that wouldn't benefit the businesses that were most affected. We knew that Don and the ADOs knew the businesses that were most affected because they were the boots on the ground. And so really having that collaborative partnership between the grant funder, the grant administrator, and the local boots on the ground was just so impactful. I think that through that as well, that program, as a program administrator, administering lots of ARPA and CARES Act programs, we've seen a lot of fraud in those programs. And I want to call out Don specifically and say that, that partnership, we had absolutely no fraud in that program. There was no fraudulent businesses that applied, no fraudulent anything that was paid. So, it was a really testament to that partnership that the local boots on the ground in collaboration with the administrator and the funder was just a great matchup.
Can you get a little bit more specific? We know that anytime there's free money to give out, there's always someone who's going to try to. There's always going to be a bad actor. How, it's so impressive that there were no bad actors applying for those grant dollars in that particular program. Why? How did that happen? How did that happen?
Well,
how did the partnership impact that?
I think that part of it is, the grant funder can have, great intentions to make sure that the funds are spent to the businesses or individuals that need it the most. And the grant administrator can try and create guidelines or program eligibility that reflects that. But it can feel siloed if you don't have that kind of third spoke, like Don talked about, of understanding the boots on the ground. The ADOs that we worked with in that program knew exactly the businesses that were affected. They knew exactly how the businesses were affected, in what ways they were affected. The exact mom and pop shops that had the flooding come down, the road, or had the road washed away so that people couldn't come in. And so we were able to work with them to make sure that the eligibility that we created and the guidelines that we created would be able to benefit those very specific businesses. So it wasn't that fraud was just negated. It was that we didn't have the ability for bad actors to even come in because the intention was created so specifically around the people who the grant was meant to benefit.
Raven, can I
Yeah,
just add
no,
one more
please.
thing? To go even a little deeper We also had partners on our side that were nonprofits and others, the SBDC, who had people on the ground. And so they were actually meeting with grant recipients and people who were applying. So the process was very deep, and there really is no way to do that in a massive grant application that we were able to do in a regional grant, which not only protected the money from going to the wrong players, but it allowed more money to go to the right players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's when I think about fraud, it's like, I always like to frame it in the, like, it's not about keeping money away from people who don't deserve it, it's about getting more money to the people who actually do deserve it. And that's really, like, why do we care about preventing fraud? Like, why should we keep it from happening in grant programs? It's because we want the businesses that need it, that deserve it, should be accessing it. And Don, that's just such a great testament, I think, to like, the work that you're doing in working in your community and knowing which community organizations are really down there in the grassroots and who are going to understand and building partnerships, not just with the program administrator, but also with the organizations that are a little bit more closer to the actual businesses. And that's fantastic. Don, this question's for you. What advice do you have for economic developers to enhance economic resiliency and prevent future crises, that's a hard word to say, sorry, crises as we embrace this post-pandemic era?
Well, I guess the first part of that is, I don't think it's possible for us to prevent future crises. They will come. We were discussing earlier this morning, part of Maui is on fire. Who would ever think that would happen? None of us are immune to the next crisis. My team early on, because all of us, always prior to the pandemic, were focused on the big one, the big earthquake, the tsunami. We're on the coastal area, it's supposed to wipe us all out. So we've been mostly talking about that, and we were promoting companies as well as the public to have resiliency plans. Both small, anything from a mom and pop shop to large governments, and we still promote that, and it's part of our SEDS report. So I think it's very important that we may not be able to prepare for the individual event, but we know that we could be better prepared and be less reactive and more programmatic. Some of the other opportunities that we saw were lack of planning, both in private sector and public sector. We just, for some reason, we know that events will occur. We weren't necessarily prepared for a pandemic, but we know a fire will happen, we know things. So if there's one thing that I would suggest to all of you and the people and organizations you work with, is for them to at least begin a strategic plan for resiliency.
Well, it sounds like, and so maybe some additional advice from you that you gave up from the first question is early collaboration. You have lines of communication already going with the mayors in your community, in your county, and when you think about supply chain issues, or when the Skagit Bridge collapsed and all of a sudden most of Skagit County and all of Whatcom County were completely cut off from being able to access, and there was no freight could go over the bridge over the Skagit River. By already having those collaborations going, by already having those lines of communication open, that's just one step in that preparation.
It is, and we've been used to getting prepared for physical disasters. So when the pandemic happened, the sheriff department and the health department were called in, and we have a place where everybody meets for the big one. And all of a sudden, that became the pandemic location. And little did I know, being the economic development director, that I was going to be called up as the chief to be in response for the pandemic. And the first 3 months of that, I had to work 7 days a week, 14 hours a day, in the emergency center with 100 people. It was as if we were being attacked. So I think now we have to start looking at how do we use other models that are more appropriate for different types of disasters.
Kelsey, you worked at City of Spokane for a while. Anything you'd like to add?
Well, I mean, just kind of piggybacking off of Don's point, not reinventing the wheel. We all got through something really big, and got really creative and innovative with these, hubs of emergency response teams. And so really, utilizing the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic to continue that model. I think that everyone got really creative with how to make sure that their community was served and supported, and so to keep that, mentality going.
Great, thank you. All right, this one is for the whole panel. Policies and regulations that come out of government, I don't know if any of you know this, they can have significant impacts on economic development. Just, that's the end of the question. Just a statement. We've heard a lot about the word resilience. I think we've all kind of seen some of the shifts from talking about economic sustainability to economic resilience. What policy changes and initiatives should we be prioritizing right now to create this environment that encourages that sustainable or resilient economic growth? Yeah, Aubrey, I'm gonna pick on you first.
Well, I think piggybacking off of what Don said, I think planning is critical. There's a lot of funding, and I think reflective of that, a lot of agencies are funding even planning projects that may be a phase 1 or tier 1 planning project. So I think really going back, understanding each census tract within your jurisdiction, understanding the needs, and then developing a plan based on those solutions, and then putting the people and the resources together necessary to ensure that the intended outcomes are realized. So I really think planning is critical to that point.
Mm-hmm. Great. Anything else that you think folks should be aware of? I know you and I have been talking a little bit about like Justice 40 and some of those initiatives.
Correct. So I would say Justice 40 is a great initiative to look out for under Inflation Reduction Act. Justice 40, and then there's some links. One is climate, economic screening, or justice screening tool. So we have CEJST. So Justice 40 is really putting 40% of funding in what's called underserved communities, underserved not just economically, but also environmentally. There's some indicators like tree canopy, greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera. But the mapping tool, which is CEJST, you can click on it and really look at your specific location. And when you find those places that are considered underserved communities, you can develop a plan based on space, so have somewhat of a target-specific approach. And I think that's when the planning becomes really looking at where are those hot spots, what can be done, who are the key players in those industries that make up that space, so that I would say Justice 40, CEJST, too. Those are really great opportunities to look regarding initiatives.
Great. Any other policy or initiatives that you're seeing out there that folks should be thinking about?
Broadband access is another good one. And then just overall Inflation Reduction Act. It's $369 billion. A lot of it is in tax credits. Changing the game for nonprofit agencies where historically they're tax exempt. Now they can benefit from tax credits for energy efficient projects. I want to say around $42 billion is for competitive grants, which I think is really a key for jurisdictions, nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations. So yeah, Inflation Reduction Act, broadband access, Justice 40, and then using some of those mapping tools to really show your area so that you can, which is what the funding agencies want to see. They want to see that you know your community, you know the needs, and you're building a strategy to address those needs.
Don, how are you thinking about resiliency, and what initiatives and policies would you encourage folks to think about as they try to make their own economic areas more resilient?
Good question, and I think we're taught so much to be planners and to plan for the future, and yet we've used the word crisis quite a bit over the last few years, but in my opinion, we haven't acted as if it was a crisis. We've gone back to a planning model. And so housing is a great example of that. We know we have a housing crisis. If we had a tsunami come in, I can promise you that we would build housing quicker than what we're doing today. So to me, to really emphasize that sometimes you have to adapt the model quicker and to get results on the ground quicker and to move away from as in-depth a planning process as we would like to have to get a better result would be a big part of that.
Great. Kelsey, do you have anything you want to add in there?
I think that just that idea of the collaborative model in resiliency is so important, just because, again, that the idea that every organization has something important to add, that it's not just an ADO or an administrator of a program, but that and maybe an ADO has a lot of skills and tools and boots on the ground, and a program administrator has a lot of the technology behind it, and to make sure that for the next disaster, for the next crisis, that everyone really is able to shine and stay in their lane and do what they do best is a great model to be able to move forward.
And I'm going to take a wild guess that when you're thinking about advocating for policies or going after different initiatives that, Dawn all by yourself as the Port of Bellingham, like maybe that's not the move. Aubrey, you've seen, you come from Southern California, you've worked in Compton, you've worked all over the place. Do you have recommendations for how to, form some of these like multiple government, regional approaches to some of these initiatives so that it's not just one organization going alone?
Yes, Raven, and great point. I think regional approaches are pretty much the answer to some of these regional issues. And so I would definitely say look at your organization's mission statement, vision statement, align that with some of the initiatives from the county level, from the state level, from the local city level. And we often find that our interests overlap. And from a CBO standpoint, I think really showing how you can, benefit the initiatives that are already going on within those regional approaches is critical. One example, there was My Brother's Keeper initiative, was statewide, but every mayor had to sign up for that initiative. And at this time, it was in the city of Compton, oversaw that initiative, and really looking at each, really being serious about the database of players per census tract. So we would get nonprofit organizations, any faith-based organizations that had the ear of a congregation or a nonprofit exec that say like Kelsey, domestic violence, so they had critical information that otherwise governments wouldn't have. So really getting those players that are often marginalized involved in the process, and you need those key, what's called trusted messengers involved in these approaches. And oftentimes it's hard from a regional standpoint to go to that granular level and get participation at that block level, so to speak. So I think that type of collaboration is critical.
Yeah, for sure. Kelsey from City Spokane hat on or forward hat on, anything else?
I think from the City of Spokane perspective, honestly, when I was administering the rental assistance program for the City of Spokane, partnering with Forward, as well as several other nonprofits, that model that Aubrey was just speaking of really understanding not only the jurisdictional requirements, but what the boots on the ground, the ADOs, the nonprofits are tasked with as well, and their goals is so critical. And so, having that collaboration where then there's a potential, program administrator who can ensure that, audit and financial documentation is secure, that can stand up to the test of time, but that, again, that the targeted beneficiaries of the programs are served. That's just such an important model.
Right, thank you. So I always kind of like the field of dreams, right? Like if you build it, they will come, but like actually it turns out no. And if you run an effective program or do good work in your community, but you don't tell anyone about it, and you don't measure those impacts and communicate them, like did you actually do very much? And I always like, I obviously work it forward, and we always like to say that we're really here to like help our customers look really good. Whether or not our customer is a city manager going to their city council or the city council going to their constituents. So Aubrey, this question's for you, kind of with that framing, but how can economic developers especially effectively communicate the potential impact of the work that they're doing. Not just to like make themselves look good, but also to attract additional private and public funding partners.
Yes. Well, I would say, and I keep going back to this, one, understand the needs by the space. So really having that target-specific approach. Once you have your goals, to address those issues, and then the strategies, create those measurable outcomes. So first, you want to gather a baseline. Hey, where are we today within, let's say, this specific census tract? Where do we want to be 10 years from now, 5 years from now, 3 years from now? And really create those indicators. Look at those, let's say, economic development, unemployment. Where I remember some of the jurisdictions in my area, 17% unemployed, so they were really above the county level. So the goal was economic development. So we wanted to target some stakeholders that were really good with job creation, workforce development, but we had to know where we started from. So we gathered our baseline data. I would say data is really critical. So Bureau of Labor Statistics, other credible sources to get your unemployment rates or other indicators, and then being able to look at the end of the strategies, let's say 3 years from now, where did we end up? And being able to have a centralized reporting or database so that you can communicate that to the public, to the residents, to governing bodies, and then funding agencies. So I would definitely say, understanding space, where your goals are, understanding that baseline information, like where you're starting from, gathering that information to be able to present it to those different governing bodies and stakeholders.
Great. Don, I know we just closed out a really successful program with you. You probably have some good advice for folks about how to communicate on the successes that you've had as an organization, not just, again, to funding, but also to your community. What tips do you have?
Well, it's difficult now. All of us have been so overwhelmed this last few years with grant programs. I can't imagine what the public must feel, because I know us as an organization where we've been focused on it have not been able to keep up with it. And it still seems like every day I receive a few emails from either Commerce or some federal organization about a new grant program that's coming through, and that you have to tourism, and so some of it has to do with really being able to choose and focus which grants are best for your community, and to promote those back to partnerships, working with our partners, public-private partnership, so that we can get it out there. Just putting in some extra time and energy into this, realizing that at the end of the day, you're making a big difference in some individual or organization. Small grants that we were working on, the Northwest grants that Ford helped us out with, there were a number of people that wrote us that said if it was not for that grant, they would not be open. So keeping that in mind allows you, because we're all to a degree public servants, and we're doing this work to make a difference. And it's easy to forget that, and I think you have to have that mantra as times are bad, that you're doing this for the right reason, and if you make a little difference in just one individual or organization, that's a big difference for them. So.
And then how do you communicate that outward? Because it's like, I love a feel-good, warm, fuzzy story as much as like the next cat video watching person out there. But like, how do you, like, that's great, but how do you communicate that out? Yeah, like how do you share that impact? Because those impacts, like that human story is so important. Like the work, getting those grants to people who were victims of flooding, that was a huge impact on their life, but how do you get that out further? So it's not just that one person like talking about it at Thanksgiving.
So we're being a public agency. We have a little bit, some avenues that private agencies or organizations may not. So of course we have newsletters, we have our mayor's meetings, we have council presentations, port commission meetings, and those are all public meetings. So often we mention these things. Sometimes we actually bring in this case, grant recipients to, I don't want to say testify, but that they were they volunteer to be thankful and bring that message. And there's nothing like that power of the individual who received the benefit to for others to listen. When I say that I supported a grant, it's a very different message than the individual who received that message, that grant, and told the public the impact of it. So it's repeating it, it's getting it out there, it's talking to you all. You know.
Sharing it with the community. Yeah, Kelsey, you've done a lot of this. Go
I was
ahead.
going to say, I wanted to add some context there too. You know, part of what we are able to provide a lot of our customers is we're doing it for a jurisdiction down in LA, providing an impact report after our programs are completed for the city to be able to then share out, report out to not just their local, colleagues, but to also cities nationwide, so they can kind of talk about the program that they did, and it can be shared among cities everywhere. As well, what we do is we provide some really cool data visualizations. One of the things we did recently was provide a breakdown of a specific jurisdiction that we provided grants to by their ward districts or council districts. And so it's a great way to be able to really glorify the work that was done and really be able to show where the funds maybe were needed and then where they actually went to, whether it's city council or local papers.
I apologize, but that's a great example. I forgot that. So Forward did that for us on our last grant program. I think it was presented to us a couple of weeks ago. They were supportive enough to give us that presentation, which I then forwarded out. So all of the city mayors received it, the county exec received it, and they spread that word. So and they're always on the line for whether they're wasting public funds. So this supports the use of that money and where it went and who received it. So it was very powerful.
Great. Not to put too fine of a point on it, but I know it's really easy to make reports out of zip codes, but I liked that report being done by ward because, or legislative district, because who actually cares about a zip code? People want to know okay, where's my sphere of influence and how am I impacting that sphere of influence so I can go back to my constituents? And also, Sir Kelsey, what you said earlier about not reinventing the wheel. If you're having a program that's working really well and you have success, spread that news with your colleagues because they don't have to reinvent the same wheel. If it's already being done successfully in one place, replicate it. Scale that. Cool. Aubrey, this question's for you. Mostly because you're such an expert in government policy and funding, especially. You already talked a bit about the Justice 40. It's really great to have you here. I know that there's a desire here to foster that resilient and sustainable economic growth in our regions. We also know that there's a lot of new funding opportunities coming up. I don't know, does anyone listen to the Daily podcast? They just did something about IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. So we know there's money coming. But what tips do you have for the folks here about how they can position themselves to take advantage of some of these opportunities that are coming? What are the opportunities and how do we take advantage of them?
Great question. So yes, great opportunity, Inflation Reduction Act. I think from the competitive grant side, we just submitted a grant in Southern California under Department of Agriculture. So Inflation Reduction Act is distributing these funds through different agencies. So USDA is one of them, Department of Labor, et cetera. So in this case, we understand what the goal is from Department of Agriculture. They put it in the grant application specific, and this one was enhancing tree canopy. It's an urban forestry grant, so we partnered with the city. We looked at a jurisdiction that we felt would really, using the tools that the CEJST tool that I talked about, it highlights those places that are incentivized for grant programming and enhances the competitiveness of your grant. So we looked at a city, received a letter of support from the city. So you get a letter of support from a city or a county or your regional, that is hugely beneficial for your grant submission process. So we received an agreement to plant trees throughout every census tract in the city. Then, in addition to the jurisdiction, we look for CBOs. Inherent in IRA is workforce development. So we partnered with, in Southern California, there's a youth bill, so California Youth Bill, True People and Conservation Corps. So we put together a powerful partnership that we felt could feasibly administer this program across cities. So it was expanded outside of Bell, but we needed that partnership. So we wanted to identify strong CBOs involved. And then from a forward standpoint, one of the challenges with these funds, I remember going back in COVID, we received funding from the Department of Justice, from the Department of Commerce, from HUD, and it becomes challenging from a capacity standpoint to juggle all of these fundings, report at the drop of a dime. So you really need, I would say a tech-based company that streamline this process, this program administration. So we, as Ford, are serving as that background to streamline this process, because it is a large project, and not only a project, but a program where participants are going to need some wraparound services, and we want to be able to document that with supporting documentation, with any invoices or any type of documents that the funding agencies are going to require at the end of the grant. So we kind of just looked at that entire scope of work, put the players together. So I would just say always look at the space, look at your goals, the people, the key players involved, and how you're going to actually administer the program and then report out. So those are just some examples of how to position yourself for this new funding. And then I would say look through grant.gov. There's a lot of Inflation Reduction Act funding coming up. I think EDA is Economic Development Administration. There's a recompete grant coming out, Solar for All, and each one of those grants will tell you in detail, how to prepare. But I think generically that would help position you for these awards.
So there's a lot. So you said earlier, 300 something billion. How much money?
369 billion.
And then how much of that is available for competitive grants?
42 billion.
Whew, okay. So you mentioned workforce development. Can you just draw the line for me between like urban forestry and workforce development? And maybe a few other examples of projects that you're seeing grants being written for?
Yes. So when your location develops a strategy to address climate change based on your community, you're going to need businesses, you're going to need people with the skills to maintain. So viability is critical. If we're planting trees, somebody has to maintain the trees. Or if we're creating an infrastructure for charging stations, which is another example, someone has to install those charging stations, someone has to maintain it. So these are jobs that your residents can have. So any type of these very aggressive goals to address climate change, it's going to take a huge workforce, and you don't want your residents to be left out of that workforce. So they want to see that there is some workforce development, and you're building marketable skills looks different based on the person. So some even having some wraparound services, may need professional development assistance, or may need some real job fairs, or so whatever it takes to get your community involved in the new green jobs without them being left behind. That it's a benefit for the community and economic upward mobility for the excuse me.
All right, like pens during the.
I'm sorry. Yeah, so
there's a fly for those who can't see it.
Yeah, so I would just say really looking at the solution to climate change, but also inheriting the solution is economic upward mobility. So ensuring that your residents are benefiting from the jobs or careers that are associated with you solving those problems.
Great, thank you. Don, for economic development agencies that are here but don't have a grant writer, right? This is something I complain about, right? Like if you're a community and you don't have a grant writer, you're not gonna be able to access the funds, which just makes you fall further and further and further behind, and just becomes a vicious cycle and better catch-22, because then you can't afford a grant writer because you don't have any access to funds. So for those who don't have grant writers, what advice do you have on how to access these resources? How to tap into that $42 billion.
Yeah, well, we keep on hearing the word competitive grant. So just being able to fill out a grant application does not make you necessarily competitive. So if you're going to go through all of the work and effort
Touche.
to go through that process, you clearly want to have an application that's competitive. I work for a relatively larger organization where we have a finance department and we have access through the county and others for individuals that specialize in grants. And if the grant is large enough, we would probably hire out. But for those of you who work in smaller organizations, there are companies, consultants, both for fee and non-fee that support grant writing. So I would say that's the first part of it. The second part, which really should probably be the first part, is should you go after that grant to begin with? Any of you who have been successful at getting a grant may have found out that the cost of working through the grant process is as much or more than the money that you received. So it's not easy to get the grant, and once you get the grant, it's not easy to go through the process of quarterly reports, financial reviews, all of those things. So I would suggest that that you all are very clear in the grant that you go after before you actually do.
Aubrey, any final words of advice, anything to add?
Yes, I would just agree with Don, spot on. The grant seeking, winning, and then administration process can be cumbersome. So having that background support, and that's one of the reasons why I joined the Forward team. We have a social impact division that is helping organizations write the grant with the lens of actually administering the funds and getting the funds where they need to be. So yes, when we're looking at the competitive grants, we're assisting with your capacity to look at the metrics. So each grant will say, 10 points for your budget narrative, another 20 points for location. So really assessing with all of the stakeholders, how competitive will we be when submitting this grant. And once there's an agreement, we move forward with the grant, look at the scope of work, program design, but then the administration part. I think once you win the grant, that's when you're open to audits, scrutiny from the government, and that's where Forward comes in as that program administration powerhouse that helps to get the funds securely, quickly, and equitably, and being able to report out on the drop of a dime, those quarterly reports, as Don stated, financial reports, and not just the financial report, but the outcomes. How many people did you actually serve? And having a documentation in a centralized database to pull that up at the request of constituents or funding agencies or governing bodies. So that's what I would add.
Right. Yeah, it's all about that impact report, right?
Exactly.
Without showing impact, you can't get more access to resources, which you can't invest in your communities.